Nice to meet you, Nick. It's a pleasure having you here.
Hey.
It is nice to meet you finally. I've heard an awful lot about you.
Hey.
Television has always been a place where we invest our hearts. We follow characters through breakups and makeups, through victories and heartbreaks, through seasons that span years of our own real lives. We grow attached in ways that feel almost embarrassing to admit out loud. You start caring about fictional people the way you care about distant cousins. You don't see them every day, but you'd absolutely notice if they stopped showing up at family reunions. So imagine settling in for a new episode of your favorite show, popcorn in hand, and slowly realizing that someone is missing. Not killed off in a dramatic season finale, not sent away in a tearful farewell episode. Just gone. No explanation, no mention, no goodbye. The show carries on like that person never existed, and you're sitting there wondering if you somehow imagined them entirely. This phenomenon is so common in television history that it actually has a name. Chuck Cunningham syndrome, named after a character we'll get to shortly. It describes the baffling moment when a show simply erases a character without ceremony, without explanation, and without apology. It happens more than you'd think, and it has been happening since the earliest days of the medium. Today, we're counting down 10 television characters who vanished from their respective shows without so much as a waved goodbye. Some disappeared because of behind-the-scenes drama. Some were casualties of network decisions. Some left because of real-life circumstances that had nothing to do with storytelling. And a few just walked out the door because nobody in the writer's room remembered to write them back in. These are their stories. Or more accurately, this is the story of their endings, quiet, unannounced, and completely unfair to the viewers who actually cared about them. Family Ties was one of the defining sitcoms of the 1980s. Built around the Keaton family and propelled into superstardom largely by a young Michael J. Fox, the show was sharp, warm, and consistently entertaining. It was the kind of program that felt like it had everything figured out. And then Nick Moore walked through the door, and everything got a little more interesting. Nick was introduced in Season 4 as Mallory Keaton's boyfriend, a rough-around-the-edges artist played with genuine magnetism by Scott Valentine. He wore a leather jacket with the confidence of someone who'd never owned anything else. He spoke in a kind of low, unhurried growl. He was, in every possible way, the opposite of the buttoned-up Keaton household, and that contrast was television gold. What was meant to be a single guest appearance turned into something much bigger almost overnight. Audiences responded to Nick with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including the network. NBC looked at the viewer reaction and saw dollar signs. The decision was made to try to spin the character off into his own series, which sounds straightforward enough until you realize they tried it 3 separate times and failed every single one. The first attempt centered on Nick moving back to live with his grandfather. The project was in development when the actor cast as the grandfather, Herschel Bernardi, passed away, and the whole thing collapsed before it ever reached air. The second attempt placed Nick in a juvenile detention center in a kind of redemption-themed premise that never quite found its footing in the scripting stage. The third attempt, titled The Art of Being Nick, actually made it to the screen. It aired as a pilot, featured a guest appearance from Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and drew solid ratings. NBC passed on it anyway. After that final door closed, Nick returned to Family Ties for the tail end of Season 7, and then simply ceased to exist within the show's universe. No farewell scene, no argument, no breakup, no explanation for why Mallory's longtime boyfriend had simply evaporated. The producers, focused on wrapping up the series in its final season, decided to narrow the focus back to the core Keaton family, and Nick was left on the cutting room floor of history. The irony is remarkable. This was a character the network spent 2 years actively trying to build a franchise around. They believed in him enough to develop 3 separate vehicles. And when none of those worked out, the response was to quietly pretend he'd never existed at all. No send-off episode, no dignified exit, just silence. There's something uniquely unsettling about a child character disappearing from a television show without acknowledgement. Adults can be explained away with job transfers or off-screen relationships or any number of convenient narrative devices. Children are harder to write around, which makes it all the more strange when a show decides not to even try. 227 was a beloved NBC sitcom set in a Washington, D.C. apartment building, revolving around the lives of its residents with a particular focus on warm community dynamics and sharp humor. Marla Gibbs, who audiences knew well from her years on The Jeffersons, anchored the show as Mary Jenkins. Among the supporting cast was a young actress named Kia Goodwin, who played Tiffany Holloway, the quiet and sweet daughter of Rose, one of the building's residents. Tiffany was introduced from the very beginning as part of the show's social fabric. She was best friends with Brenda, Mary's daughter, a character played by a then-unknown Regina King, who would go on to win an Academy Award decades later. Tiffany's presence helped ground the series in a sense of genuine neighborhood community. She wasn't a scene-stealing character, but she was a consistent and recognizable piece of the world the show had built. After the second season, she was gone. The show did not write her out. There was no episode where Rose explained that Tiffany had gone to live with relatives or transferred to a boarding school. There was a brief appearance in a third-season episode, and then nothing. Rose simply continued her life on screen as though the daughter she had been raising had never existed, and the rest of the characters played along without blinking. The reason, it turned out, had nothing to do with the character or the storytelling. Kia Goodwin's mother was unhappy living in California, where the show was produced. She wanted to return to New York, and NBC agreed to release the young actress from her contract. The family left, and Tiffany Holloway left with them, except nobody told the viewers, and nobody told the writers to come up with even the most basic explanation. It is the kind of disappearance that feels almost insulting in its casualness. A child was simply subtracted from a mother's life on screen, and the audience was expected to accept it without question. The A-Team was one of the most entertaining action shows of the 1980s, built on a formula so reliable it practically ran itself. For misfit soldiers with complementary skills, an impossible mission, a plan that somehow worked despite all appearances to the contrary, and just enough explosions to keep everyone awake. It was not subtle television, but it was enormously fun, and in its early days it had something that elevated it slightly above pure spectacle. Amy Amanda Allen, played by Melinda Cooley. Amy was a journalist who served as the civilian perspective on the team's operations. She was introduced in the pilot episode and became a regular presence through the first season and into the second. Her function in the narrative was crucial. She gave audiences a grounded, relatable point of view in a world that was otherwise populated entirely by men with guns and extraordinary tolerance for explosions. She was smart, resourceful, and gave the show a dimension it genuinely benefited from having. Behind the scenes, however, things were considerably less harmonious. Cooley reportedly wanted the character to have a more active role in the team's operations, to be less of an observer and more of a participant. The producers were resistant. George Peppard, who played the team's leader Hannibal and whose influence on the show was considerable, was said to be uncomfortable with a female character occupying significant screen time. The tension between what Cooley felt the character deserved and what the production was willing to give her became impossible to navigate. Midway through the second season, Amy was written out with a brief and almost laughably casual explanation. She had gone on assignment in Jakarta. That was it. No emotional goodbye, no acknowledgement of everything she had contributed, no recognition of the relationships she had built with the team over the course of more than a season. The van drove away, and she was not in it. The network attempted to fill the void with another female character, Tonia Baker, introduced not long after Amy's departure. That character disappeared too, with even less ceremony. The A-Team continued without meaningful female presence for the remainder of its run, and whatever warmth and balance Amy had brought to the show went with her. One Day at a Time was ahead of its time in almost every way that mattered. A comedy drama centered on a divorced mother raising two daughters alone in Indianapolis. It tackled subjects that most network television of the 1970s and 1980s preferred to ignore entirely: addiction, independence, the complexities of single parenthood, the messiness of family relationships when the traditional structure has come apart. It was a show that took its characters seriously, which made the treatment of Julie Cooper all the more difficult to reconcile. Julie was played by Mackenzie Phillips, and she was one of the show's central figures from its very beginning. As the eldest daughter of an Romano, Julie brought fire and stubbornness and a kind of reckless energy that balanced beautifully against her younger sister Barbara's more measured personality. The character was married across the series, became a mother herself, and evolved in ways that reflected genuine character development rather than the surface-level changes many sitcoms settle for. What happened to Julie Cooper cannot be separated from what was happening to Mackenzie Phillips off-screen. Phillips struggled with addiction throughout her time on the series, a battle that was well documented years later in her memoir, but that was playing out invisibly for most viewers during the show's run. She was fired after the 5th season, brought back for the 7th, and then dismissed again during the final season following a relapse. The show's handling of her absences was inconsistent at best. When Julie disappeared, the writers did not construct careful explanations. There would be vague references, a letter mentioned in passing, an offhand comment about where she supposedly was. The character was treated like a loose thread that the narrative kept trying to tuck away, rather than properly tie off. Given how central Julie had been to the emotional architecture of the show, the carelessness was jarring. The final exit was not a dignified one. There was no goodbye episode, no scene that honored everything the character had meant to the series. A presence that had defined the show from its premiere was simply allowed to fade away into narrative silence. The Cosby Show changed American television in ways that are still being felt decades later. At its peak, it was not merely a popular program. It was a cultural institution, the cornerstone of NBC's Thursday night dominance, and proof that a show built around an upper-middle-class black family could attract an enormous and devoted audience regardless of race or background. The Huxtable household became one of the most familiar addresses in American pop culture, which makes what happened to Martin Kendall all the stranger. Martin was introduced in the 6th season as the husband of Denise Huxtable, Cliff and Claire's second eldest daughter. His arrival was the kind of dramatic entrance that good serial storytelling thrives on. Denise had gone off to college and come back, not just with new experiences, but with a husband nobody had met and a stepdaughter named Olivia. The family's reaction, the adjustment period, the gradual acceptance of this man into the Huxtable orbit, all of it made for compelling television. Joseph Phillips played Martin with a steadiness and warmth that felt genuinely integrated into the family dynamic. He was not a peripheral figure. He attended dinners, participated in family discussions, developed relationships with Cliff and Claire that had real texture. Through seasons 6, 7, and into 8, he was a presence. And then he was not. His final on-screen appearance came in a season 8 episode, after which the explanation offered was that he had been stationed in Singapore and Denise had gone with him, leaving Olivia with the Huxtables. The logistics were strange. Olivia remained a regular presence on the show, while her parents were apparently living on the other side of the world, and everyone seemed largely unbothered by this arrangement. In the series finale, it was revealed through a phone call that Denise was pregnant with Martin's child. Neither character appeared on screen. A man who had been part of the family for years received a telephone mention as his farewell. It was a conclusion entirely unworthy of what the character had been. The Golden Girls became one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history, and the chemistry between its 4 lead characters is a large part of why. Blanche, Rose, Dorothy, and Sophia feel inevitable, as though the show could never have been anything other than exactly what it was. But before that chemistry existed, there was a different version of the concept, one with a different 5th member of the household who appeared in the pilot episode and was never seen again. His name was Coco, and he was played by Charles Levin. He was the house cook, witty and warm and quick with a remark, and he shared screen time with the 4 women who would go on to become iconic. In the pilot, he was a functioning part of the ensemble, seemingly positioned as a regular cast member. Then the episode aired for test audiences, and everything changed. Estelle Getty had been written into the show as Sophia Petrillo with the expectation that she would appear occasionally rather than as a series regular. But test audiences reacted to her with such extraordinary enthusiasm that the producers recognized immediately what they had. The decision was made to promote Sophia to full-time status, and the math became unavoidable. 2 sharp-tongued, scene-dominating, quip-delivering characters was one too many. The show had room for one, and the audience had already decided which one they wanted. Coco's scenes in the pilot were trimmed significantly when the episode ran long, which diluted his presence before he even had a chance to establish himself. He disappeared between the pilot and the first regular episode with no explanation offered, and the Golden Girls became a quartet that felt so complete it was almost impossible to remember there had ever been an alternative. A writer who worked on the show reflected years later that the decision was creatively correct, but that Coco's story deserved more exploration than it received. One scrapped storyline had apparently involved him opening a small business in Key West. Instead, he became a piece of television trivia, the forgotten fifth Golden Girl who existed just long enough to be displaced by one of the greatest character entrances in sitcom history. Married with Children built its entire identity on the premise of gleeful dysfunction. The Bundys were not a family television was supposed to celebrate. They were loud, selfish, frequently broke, and spectacularly indifferent to the values that other sitcom families spent their running times cheerfully embodying. That was the point, and for years it worked brilliantly. The show was a genuine counterculture statement dressed up as a lowbrow comedy, and its audience loved it precisely because it never pretended to be something it wasn't. So it remains one of the stranger decisions in network television history that someone looked at this particular show and concluded that what it needed was an adorable small child. Seven arrived in the seventh season, played by Shane Sweet. He was deposited with the Bundy family by Peggy's cousins and positioned as a kind of long-term house guest who would shake up the family dynamic and, presumably, provide an injection of fresh energy. The character's name was an odd choice. His personality was an even odder fit. The problem was fundamental rather than superficial. Married with Children had spent 6 seasons establishing a specific tone, and that tone was not compatible with wide-eyed childhood innocence. The Bundys' humor was crude, cynical, and built on the absence of warmth. Inserting a young child into that environment created a dissonance that viewers felt immediately and responded to with significant displeasure. Ratings slipped. The letters network executives received were not positive. The response was swift and characteristically graceless. Seven was simply removed from the show without explanation. He had appeared. He had been rejected by the audience, and now he was gone. The show did eventually acknowledge his disappearance in the most Married with Children way imaginable. His face appeared on a milk carton in a later episode, labeled as missing. It was a joke, and a darkly funny one, but it was also the only acknowledgement the character ever received. He had been erased, and the milk carton was the eraser's punchline. Family Matters is remembered primarily for one thing, and that thing is Steve Urkel. The show began as a spin-off of Perfect Strangers, built around the Winslow family, and meant to be a warm, ensemble-driven domestic comedy. Then Jaleel White showed up as the nerdy, suspender-wearing neighbor next door. Audiences went wild, and everything changed. What is less remembered is that in the process of becoming the Steve Urkel show, Family Matters quietly misplaced one of its own family members. Judy Winslow was the youngest Winslow child, played by Jamie Foxworth. She was part of the family from the very beginning, appearing in the pilot and remaining through the first 4 seasons as a regular presence. She was not a central character in the way that her older siblings Laura and Eddie were, but she was a Winslow, and the show had established the family unit as its emotional foundation. After the 4th season, Judy was simply gone. She did not get a goodbye episode. There was no explanation offered for where she had gone or why her parents were no longer mentioning her. The family continued to function and be presented as a family, while one of their children had effectively been removed from existence. Carl and Harriet Winslow, who were depicted as loving and attentive parents throughout the series, apparently lost a daughter without anyone finding it worth remarking upon. The behind-the-scenes reality was that the show's budget was under pressure and decisions had to be made about where resources were directed. With Urkel consuming an increasing amount of the show's creative and narrative energy, and with the younger characters receiving less development, cuts were made. Foxworth's contract was not renewed. Judy was not written out. She was simply not written in anymore. Jamie Foxworth has spoken in interviews over the years about the experience of being erased from a show, and it is a difficult story. She was a child when it happened, and the abruptness of it, combined with the show's complete refusal to acknowledge Judy's existence afterward, created a particular kind of confusion and hurt that lingered for years. We arrive now at the character who gave the syndrome its name, the original vanishing act, the gold standard against which all subsequent unexplained disappearances are measured. Chuck Cunningham of Happy Days, Richie's older brother, basketball enthusiast, and the most famous person in television history to simply walk upstairs and never come back down. Happy Days premiered in 1974 and quickly became one of the most popular shows on American television. Set in the 1950s in Milwaukee, it followed the Cunningham family and their circle of friends through the relatively innocent cultural landscape of the post-war decade. Richie Cunningham, played by Ron Howard, was the show's protagonist. His parents, Howard and Marion, were warm and dependable presences, and in the early episodes there was Chuck, an older brother who played basketball, grunted occasionally, and filled the role of the classic jock sibling. The character was played by two different actors across the first season. Gavin O'Herlihy originated the role, later explaining that he had no interest in playing a character whose contribution to each episode consisted largely of bouncing a ball and delivering monosyllabic reactions. Randolph Roberts stepped in after O'Herlihy's departure, but the character never found traction with audiences or with the writers, who clearly had limited imagination for what Chuck could contribute. Meanwhile, a leather-jacketed character who had been introduced as a secondary figure was becoming impossible to ignore. Arthur Fonzarelli, the Fonz, was capturing audience attention in a way the show's creators had not anticipated, and the spotlight was shifting accordingly. In a world where Fonzie existed, Chuck Cunningham became entirely redundant. He was written out not with a scene, not with a mention, but with nothing at all. One episode he existed, the next he did not. The Cunningham family continued as a family of 4 rather than 5, and the subject was never raised. The strangeness of this is amplified by the show's setting. Happy Days was explicitly positioned as a celebration of 1950s American values: family, community, stability, the warmth of a more innocent time. The Cunninghams were supposed to embody those values, and yet here was a family that had simply forgotten one of their children, and the show set in the era of family values had nothing to say about it. Chuck Cunningham's disappearance became so notorious that it transcended the show itself. His name became shorthand for a specific kind of narrative cowardice, the decision to erase a character rather than write them a proper exit. More than half a century later, the syndrome that bears his name is still being documented, still being discussed, still being added to with new examples. That is a strange kind of immortality. He vanished so completely that the vanishing itself became the most memorable thing about him. 10 characters, 10 departures, 10 moments where television decided that continuity and character dignity were optional. What is striking, looking across all of these stories, is how rarely the disappearances were the result of creative decisions made in the best interest of the storytelling. More often, they were the result of budget pressures, casting conflicts, network interference, personal struggles, or simple indifference. The characters paid the price, and the viewers were left to quietly wonder what had happened. Television has changed considerably since most of these disappearances occurred. The streaming era has brought with it a higher expectation of narrative consistency, and audiences who are accustomed to binge-watching entire seasons in a weekend are less forgiving of the kind of continuity gaps that weekly broadcast schedules once made easier to overlook. A character who vanished between September and January on a 1980s network show might not be noticed by half the audience. A character who vanishes between episode 4 and episode 5 on a streaming platform will generate online discussion within hours. And yet the underlying pressures that created Chuck Cunningham's syndrome have not disappeared. Actors still have conflicts with productions. Networks still make decisions that prioritize economics over storytelling. Real life still intervenes in ways that force unplanned changes. The specific form may evolve, but the phenomenon persists. What these 10 characters share, beyond their unexplained exits, is that they mattered to someone. Every single one of them had viewers who noticed their absence, who felt the gap they left, who cared enough to still be talking about it years, and in some cases decades later. That is not nothing. A character who is mourned, even by a subset of the audience, even after they have been erased from the show's own memory, leaves a mark. Chuck Cunningham walked up those stairs, and the Cunningham family pretended he had